Well, I am Marion Kalb, and I work with the National Farm to School Network and the Community Food Security Coalition. And we are here today. We're going to talk a little bit about policy approaches, and I think I can guarantee you that it will be an entertaining policy session. You'll hear some really interesting approaches and different kinds of legislations and how they got started and what happened to them and what made them ultimately effective and implemented. So. I also just wanted to point out before we start talking about state legislation that in your packet there is a sheet on child nutrition draft priorities, which we talked a little bit about yesterday. And these are the draft priorities that have come together from the national network with input from folks all around the country. And we are still looking for input. So please talk to myself or Deb or give us a call or write us an email if you have changes, suggestions, additions. Bring it back to the folks that you work with and let us know what you think. And we'll keep moving forward and redrafting and reprioritizing and hopefully address the issues that are important to everyone. So what the panelists are going to do today, basically, is they're going to talk about how they started their policy work, who was involved with their work, what their selling points were, or how they framed their message, how they got their point across about the necessity for this legislation, who opposed it, what did they oppose, why did they oppose it, how did they address that, and why was it successful? Really, what was the reason that they were successful in its passage? And before we get to our speakers, I just wanted to relate one small personal story of how not to do policy work. And this was my very first foray into policy many, many years ago as the director of Southland Farmers Market Association in Los Angeles. And in that position, I had a board that was primarily made up of farmers, and they were outraged over the fact that whenever they crossed a county line, and they did that a lot in LA because many of them would sell in 4 or 5 counties, whenever they crossed a county line, they had to register their scale, and that involved a fee of anywhere from $100 to $200. Now, when they registered their scale, it wasn't checked. No one looked to see if it was actually measuring correctly. It was simply for the privilege of taking one scale into another county that they had to pay that money. So they said to me, Marion, go change that. So I said, okay, and went up to Sacramento, and I thought, well, maybe the first way to approach this would be to visit legislators that have farmers markets in their district. So that's what I did. I went to where the biggest farmers markets were, and I talked to legislators themselves, and I talked to staff, and nobody cared. I got absolutely nowhere. So I realized I was going to have to be there for more than one day, so I went shopping for more clothing. And then the next day, I decided to try a different approach and go visit the legislators that represented farmers, that had farmers in their districts. So I immediately went to Senator Jim Costa, who at the time was the chair of the Agriculture Committee. And I walked in without an appointment, and I started talking to his scheduler. Her name is Wally. No longer there, but her name was Wally. And she said, so what's your problem? So I told her. We talked about it for a while, and she said, the senator will support that. I said, really? She said, oh, yeah. I said, well, I'm running into trouble because nobody will support this. I've been to all these people, and no one has any interest in it. She said, go back to those same people and tell them that Senator Costa is now supporting this, and we'll write the legislation for you. I said, okay. So I did. I went back, and I talked to all the other offices, and amazingly, there they all were. They said, yes, absolutely, we will support this bill. So I went back to Wally, and I said, that worked. What do I need to do next? Because I'm pretty sure all the counties are going to oppose me on this because we're taking money away from them. So she said, right. So she made a couple phone calls, and she got the lobbyist from the Farm Bureau, the lobbyist from the Ag Council, and they came and they sat down with me, and we talked about the issue. And they said, yeah, we can support this issue. They called the lobbyist for the county ag folks. We sat down with them, presented a united front. They caved. They said they would not continue to ask for that money. And within about a month, the legislation passed. So I tell that story because I had no idea really what I was doing. And you can get policy passed without having to make a necessarily huge deal about it when you've got a really good issue and you've got really good champions. So, and Wally. Wally was fabulous. I remember Wally very well to this day. So that's just sort of one brief introduction into the foray into the policy world. And now you're going to hear a much more organized, much more effective way to do policy from our panelists. And first, we are going to hear from Trisha. And Trisha Sexton is the Farm to School Program Coordinator at Washington State University for King County Extension. And something that you may not know about Trisha is that she had the opportunity to work with Professor Kevin Morgan and Roberta Sanino in Wales in doing farm to school research. So if you want to talk about a slightly different topic outside of the policy world, I'm sure she's got interesting stories to tell on that front too. Trisha. She just said she'll never tell them. Okay.
I want to first say that Marion's story encapsulates really well what happened in Washington State. And also to acknowledge that there's a lot of interest and pride in what happened with the Local Farms Healthy Kids bill this year in Washington State. And I want to acknowledge that in working as a team to develop the pieces of that policy, we relied greatly on the people in this room and the policies in other states, and people were very generous in having long conversations with us about the bills they had, how they worked, what didn't work, what maybe should have been added, and it was really, really helpful to work across the country with Community Food Security Coalition folks and other activists who are doing work. So thanks to all of you who helped with that. I am going to focus on the 2008 Local Farms Healthy Kids Act, but there were a few things that happened legislatively before that. In 2002, there was legislation passed that directed the Department of General Administration to work with the Washington State Department of Agriculture to identify and recommend strategies to increase purchase of locally grown foods in state institutions and other agencies that worked with the state. And then there were lots of things happening on the ground and in pockets. And in 2006, the National Conference of State Legislators, which I highly recommend as a resource to see what's happening in other states and what has been passed, they did an education site visit in Washington and brought legislators and staff from those states to come and talk about the barriers and legislative solutions. And then this past year, Local Farms Healthy Kids. In your packet, you have this blue sheet, and this is on the front of it. These are summaries of the bill, and I'm actually not going to go into this because it can take a really long time, and I don't have a really long time. So I'm going to talk to you more about how the process worked and who the champions were. Oh, and I also wanted to mention very quickly that first 2002 legislation partly resulted in this Farm to Cafeteria Connections book that was created in the Small Farms and Direct Marketing team in Washington. There are copies of this out in the hallway, and you can also look at copies that I have if you're interested. It was last updated in 2004, but the information in it is great. So around Washington, there have been a lot of interest in this for a long time, and things happening in pilot programs and around the state in little pockets here and there. And in 2003, the Farm to School Connections team was started in the Puget Sound region through my office. I was not there. Sylvia Cantor and others started that conversation. So there was a lot of networking happening and a lot of learning from different stakeholders at panel discussions and meetings about what needed to happen and where they were hitting snags. In last summer, really recently, Washington Environmental Council, who works with an environmental priorities coalition of environmental groups in Washington State, each year they choose 4 legislative priorities. They work together on those priorities so they're not working on a bunch of different issues. And this year, in conversations about what those priorities would be, Mo McBroom at Washington Environmental Council started hearing about farm to school, and she thought it sounded really promising as something that could get passed and also something that was very valuable on a lot of levels for a lot of people. So she brought together a team of mostly agency professionals and other people who'd been looking at this for a while to identify what the obstacles were to farm to school, but also specifically which of them could be addressed through state level policy change so that we could identify solutions that could be done at that level and figure out how to make it happen.